He had been getting migraines for years. He knew the shape of them. He knew how long they lasted, which pill to take, and roughly how many hours it would be before the pain finally let go of him. And then, over about 4 months, his headaches stopped behaving like his headaches. They came almost every week now. They sat low and heavy across the back of his skull, on both sides, right where the head meets the neck, and the medication that had reliably worked for years did nothing at all. He was 52. He lived in Florida with his wife and their cat, in a modern home, and he ate a completely ordinary American diet. He wasn't having seizures. Nothing was weak, nothing was numb, his face wasn't drooping, and he could speak and swallow the way he always had. When his doctor examined him that day, the neurological exam was clean. Vital signs, normal. Sitting in that room, he looked like a man having a bad run with an old, familiar problem. But his doctor didn't like that the pattern had changed, so he ordered a scan of the man's head. And what came back on that scan is the reason anyone knows about this man at all. Because his brain was full of cysts, round, fluid-filled sacs, scattered through both halves of his brain, deep in the white matter and clustered around the spaces where his spinal fluid moves. Not one of them. The word the case report uses is numerous, and one cluster toward the back right side of his head measured about 2.5 centimeters across, which is roughly a walnut sitting inside his skull. And when doctors pieced together the most likely explanation for those sacs, the trail led back to something this man had been doing quietly, happily, for most of his adult life. Something in his kitchen. Something he'd never have thought to bring up at an appointment, because why would you? He liked his bacon soft. Let's back up, because the way his doctors got there matters as much as the answer. Chronic migraine is one of the most common reasons an adult walks into a clinic holding their head. And the general approach in medicine is that a stable, long-running migraine pattern doesn't usually need brain imaging. Someone who has had the same headache for 15 years, with the same triggers and the same response to the same medicine, is not typically hiding a tumor. Scanning all of those patients would mean an enormous amount of CT radiation and a lot of false alarms, for very little benefit. What changes the calculation is when the pattern itself starts moving. A headache that suddenly arrives twice as often, one that settles into a part of the head it never used to touch, or the medicine that always ended, it just stops working. Any of that means a brain doing something new, and new deserves a look. His doctor followed that instinct, ordered a CT scan, and that decision is probably the single most important thing that happened to this man all year. The scan didn't come back with an obvious villain, though. It came back confusing. Multiple cystic areas on both sides spread through the deep tissue of both hemispheres. No swelling pushing his brain out of position, no blockage backing up the fluid inside his head. The first read on those images was that they might be congenital neuroglial cysts, which is a rare and harmless condition where fluid pockets form in the brain during development and then simply sit there, sometimes for a lifetime, often discovered by accident when someone gets scanned for an unrelated reason. Those usually turn up one at a time, which made a whole scattered field of them an odd fit. But odd fits happen. That would have been a tidy answer. It would also have meant his headaches were still just headaches, and the cysts were a coincidence. His doctors weren't willing to bet on tidy. He was admitted urgently to a hospital in Orlando so a neurosurgeon could look at him, and the imaging was repeated with an MRI, which shows soft tissue far better than a CT does. The MRI showed everything the CT had shown, and then it showed one more thing. Around those cysts, there was a bright rim. The team read that brightness as possible edema, which is fluid leaking into tissue, and edema tends to mean inflammation, and inflammation means the brain is reacting to something. That single finding is what pulled the case away from the harmless answer, because a pocket that formed while a person was still developing in the womb has no particular reason to provoke the tissue around it decades later. If the brain was reacting, then reasonably speaking, something in there was worth reacting to. The neurosurgeon looked at the pictures and decided not to operate. Instead, the team called infectious disease. That call reframed the whole case. The question was no longer what those pockets were made of. The question was, what was living in them? When specialists suspect an infection scattered through someone's brain, they don't guess. They work down a list, and every test on that list is chosen because it rules a specific organism in or out. Blood cultures and urine cultures went off first, looking for bacteria loose in his system. Nothing grew, An HIV test, because a weakened immune system opens doors that a healthy one keeps shut. Negative. Syphilis, which can settle into the nervous system years after the original infection and imitate almost anything. Non-reactive. Cryptococcus, a fungus with a real appetite for the lining of the brain. Not that either. And toxoplasma, the parasite people associate with cat litter, which absolutely can put lesions in a brain. Negative both ways, the antibodies that show a recent infection and the ones that show an old one. And then one test came back different. The blood test for cysticercosis antibodies was positive. Cysticercosis is what happens when the larval stage of a tapeworm called Taenia solium ends up inside human tissue. When those larvae settle in the nervous system, it gets its own name. Neurocysticercosis. The cysts on his scans weren't a birth defect at all. They were the fluid-filled homes of a parasite built inside the tissue of a living human brain. Taenia solium is the pork tapeworm. And to understand what happened to this man, you have to understand that this single organism can give a person two completely different diseases, depending on which part of its life cycle you swallow. The adult worm is a strange and honestly impressive animal. It lives in the human small intestine, and it can grow 2 to 7 meters long, which, at the upper end, is a flatworm longer than the car sitting in your driveway, folded up inside a person. At its head is a structure about a millimeter across, armed with suckers and a double ring of tiny hooks that grip the intestinal wall so the current of digestion can't wash it away. Behind that head, the body is a chain of segments. A mature worm carries around 1,000 of them, and each ripe segment is a packet stuffed with eggs. Tens of thousands of eggs in a single segment. Segments break off, ride out in the stool, and the eggs can survive in soil and on surfaces for days to months. A pig eats those eggs. Inside the pig, they hatch, the microscopic larvae burrow through the intestinal wall, catch a ride in the bloodstream, and settle into muscle, where each one builds itself a small, fluid-filled capsule and waits. A person eats undercooked pork carrying those capsules. The larva wakes up in the human gut, hooks on, and grows into the adult worm. That's the loop, and there's a fork in it that decides this entire case. If you eat undercooked infected pork, you get the worm in your intestine. That condition is called taeniasis, and it is often nearly silent. Mild stomach discomfort, some nausea, hunger pangs. Occasionally a person notices a segment pass. Plenty of people carry an adult tapeworm for years without ever knowing. You do not get cysts in your brain from eating pork. You get cysts in your brain from swallowing the eggs. And the eggs come out of a human being who is carrying the adult worm. So a person with a tapeworm in their gut is, without knowing it, producing infectious eggs every single day. If those eggs reach someone else's mouth, on unwashed hands, on food, in water, that person's body treats them exactly the way a pig's body does. The larvae hatch, cross the intestinal wall, ride the blood, and start looking for somewhere to settle, muscle, under the skin, the eye, and, in the cases that matter most, the brain. Which brings us back to a 52-year-old man in Florida who had never been to a country where this parasite is common, whose only trip anywhere was a cruise to the Bahamas 2 years earlier, who had no contact with pigs, no farm, no well water, no raw or street food, and no food insecurity of any kind. His doctors asked him about his eating habits. He told them he had eaten lightly cooked, non-crispy bacon for most of his life. That detail on its own doesn't explain a brain full of cysts, and his doctors knew it. Eating bad pork gives you the worm, not the larvae. So they worked backward from what they had and the reconstruction they landed on, which they were careful to present as informed speculation rather than a proven chain of events, was that this man had most likely given the disease to himself. Reading it the way they did, it goes something like this. Somewhere in all those years, a piece of that soft bacon carried larval cysts, and he picked up an adult tapeworm in his intestine and never knew, because that infection so often announces nothing. From that point on, he was producing eggs. And at some point, after using the bathroom, with hands that weren't washed thoroughly enough, some of those eggs made the short trip from his own body back into his own mouth. There's a clinical word for that, autoinfection. I want to be honest about the limits of that, because the authors were. Nobody watched it happen. The published report never describes recovering an adult worm from him, so the first link in the chain is an inference rather than a finding. What can be said with confidence is narrower. A man with no travel to where this parasite lives, no contact with pigs, no contaminated water, and a lifelong preference for underdone pork ended up with larvae in his brain, and of the routes available, that one fits the facts better than any other. And when their write-up came out in March of 2024, the researchers added a line that made a lot of doctors sit up. They pointed out that finding infected pork in this country has historically been close to unheard of, and suggested their case might carry implications for public health. That is a very careful way of raising a very uncomfortable possibility. American pork is federally inspected, and locally acquired cases of this infection have long been treated as something close to non-existent. If this man really did pick up a tapeworm from bacon bought in an American grocery store, then an assumption a lot of us cook by may deserve another look. One case can't prove that. It can put the question on the table. Hey, quick question before we go further. Have you learned something in the last few minutes? If you have, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed, so you'll catch the next case when it goes up. I read medical journals the way other people read detective novels, and these stories are the best part of my week. Thanks for being here. So the parasite was in his brain. Why did it take 4 months of worsening headaches, and not something more dramatic, to bring him in? The answer is one of the stranger things about this infection, and it comes down to timing. When a larva first settles into brain tissue and builds its capsule, it is alive, and it is very good at hiding. As best researchers can tell, it releases substances that damp down the immune response right around it, talking the surrounding tissue into leaving it alone. During this phase, a person can carry cysts and feel completely normal. No headache, no seizure, nothing. There are people walking around today with quiet cysts in their brains, who will never know. The trouble starts when the larva dies. A larva doesn't live forever, and when it finally fails, the camouflage fails with it. The immune system, which has been effectively blindfolded, gets a full look at a foreign organism sitting inside the brain, and it responds the way it responds to any invader: swelling. Fluid pushing into tissue that has no room to spare because the skull does not expand. That inflammation is what produces symptoms. In most people, it produces seizures, which is why up to 80% of these cases first show up as a person who has never had a seizure suddenly having one. It can also produce trouble thinking clearly, or dangerous pressure building inside the head. In this man, it produced a headache. Put the swelling on his MRI next to the timing of his symptoms, and the likeliest reading is that his body had started fighting the parasites in his head, and that fight registered to him as a migraine that had turned mean. His team then ran into the part of this disease that doctors genuinely argue about. Because the inflammation comes mainly from cysts dying, medication that kills the remaining larvae can make things temporarily worse before it makes them better. You are, in effect, detonating every one of those capsules at once and asking the brain to tolerate it. Some clinicians look at a stable patient with an established infection and hesitate to pull that trigger at all. His doctors talked it through with him, weighed the risks against leaving the parasites in place, and he chose treatment. They started him on a steroid first, to blunt the inflammation and reduce swelling before anything was killed. And they watched him in the intensive care unit while the anti-parasitic medications went in. 2 of them, for 14 days. Then the steroid was slowly tapered down. He did well. The lesions on his scans regressed, and his headaches improved. He was stable enough to finish his care as an outpatient in the infectious disease clinic, which, for a man whose brain had been full of parasite cysts, is about as good an ending as this story could have had. And if this sounds like a one-off oddity, there's a story from 30-odd years ago that changed how American doctors think about this disease. Between June of 1990 and July of 1991, 4 unrelated people in an Orthodox Jewish community in New York City were diagnosed with tapeworm larvae in their brains. None of them ate pork. Only one had ever traveled to a country where the parasite is common. On paper, every one of them was impossible. What investigators found in those households were domestic employees who had recently emigrated from Latin America, and 2 of them turned out to be carrying adult tapeworms with no symptoms at all. Nobody could trace an egg from a carrier into a particular brain, and strictly speaking, that link is inferred rather than witnessed. But the life cycle narrows the possibilities hard. Larvae in a human brain have to start as eggs in a human mouth, and eggs only come from someone carrying the adult worm. The likeliest path runs from those carriers into the households onto food and hands, and into the brains of people whose religious practice meant they had never eaten the meat this parasite is named for. The CDC went back and tested part of that community. Out of nearly 1,800 people from 612 families, 23 carried antibodies, showing they had been exposed. All of them were symptom-free. Almost all of them got brain imaging, and nothing was found. Being exposed to this parasite and being made sick by it are very different things, and that survey is about as clean a demonstration of the gap as you will find anywhere. Globally, this parasite is not rare at all. It is considered one of the great preventable causes of epilepsy on Earth. In regions where it circulates freely, roughly 30% of all epilepsy cases are attributed to it, and in some high-risk communities, that figure climbs as high as 70%. Estimates of how many people are currently carrying larvae in their nervous systems run into the millions. In the United States, it is uncommon but far from unheard of. Something on the order of 1,000 hospitalizations a year, concentrated in states like California, New York, Texas, Illinois, and Oregon. One national analysis covering 2003 through 2012 put total hospital charges for this single parasitic infection above $900 million. And the researchers who ran those numbers were explicit that the real burden is bigger than what they measured, because plenty of patients are seen in emergency departments and sent home without ever being admitted, and because the disease is missed and misdiagnosed all the time. Missed, largely, for the reason this man's case demonstrates. There is no single perfect test. The presentation ranges from absolutely nothing to a medical emergency, depending entirely on where the larvae landed and how many of them are dying at once. And when someone already has a neurological diagnosis on their chart, anything new tends to get filed under the old label. He had migraines, so the headaches were migraines. Right up until somebody asked why they had changed. That, more than the bacon, is what stays with me about this case. A man walked in with a familiar complaint and a thick medical file. He had type 2 diabetes that had already damaged his nerves, high cholesterol, obesity, and years of headaches. Every one of those things offers an easy explanation for feeling unwell. It would have been so simple to adjust his migraine medication, book a follow-up in 3 months, and move on. Instead, somebody treated the change in his pattern as information rather than noise, and that's the only reason those scans were ever ordered. 23. So what do you actually do with a story like this? Nothing in this video is medical advice, and I'm not a doctor. I'm someone who finds these cases fascinating and thinks they're worth telling carefully. But a couple of unglamorous things do come out of it. Cook pork all the way through. Heat is what destroys larval cysts, so working backward from that, pale and floppy, is the texture of meat whose middle probably never got hot enough to matter. And the familiar number here is not quite the right number. The USDA recommendation for whole cuts of pork is 145 degrees Fahrenheit with a 3-minute rest, and for ground pork, it's 160. Those figures were set with bacteria in mind. The laboratory work on this particular parasite points a little higher, with cysts reliably destroyed once the core of the meat reaches somewhere around 60 to 65 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 140 to 150 Fahrenheit, and stays there for a stretch of minutes rather than seconds. Bacon is thin enough that cooking it until it's firm and crisp gets you well past that. 2 things people always ask about here. Freezing does kill these cysts, which is part of why commercially handled pork is safer than pork from an animal butchered in somebody's backyard. And curing on its own is no guarantee. Salt and smoke were never designed as parasite control, and the research on pickled and salt-cured pork is mixed enough that nobody treats it as a substitute for heat. Wash your hands properly after using the bathroom and before handling food, including in your own kitchen, including when nobody's watching. This parasite travels by the fecal-oral route, and that unglamorous habit is the strongest barrier there is against it. And the broader one, which reaches far past tapeworms. If you have lived with a chronic symptom for years and it changes character, that change deserves a conversation with your doctor. It might come more often than it used to, or stop responding to whatever always fixed it. You are the only person on the planet with a complete record of what your normal feels like, and that record is genuinely useful clinical information. Say it out loud at your next appointment, even if it sounds small. The man in this case did one more thing that mattered, and it's easy to miss. When his doctors pressed him on what he ate, he didn't brush the question away. He told them about a habit so small and so lifelong that it had never occurred to him it could be relevant, and that detail is the one that made the whole picture make sense. If this case got you thinking, tell me in the comments. I'm especially curious whether any of you have had a symptom waved off as your usual problem when it turned out to be something else entirely, because those stories are how a lot of doctors learn to ask better questions. And there's another case waiting for you next month, one where an entirely ordinary daily habit ended somewhere nobody expected. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourself.